Hello, welcome to Surviving Stalking. Today we are going to listen to and discuss the second part of an interview with Mark Wynn, a childhood survivor of domestic violence who as an adult dedicated his life as a police officer to stopping abusers, sexual predators, and stalkers from terrorizing other people. In episode 1, Mark described his childhood with a stepfather who abused, isolated, and manipulated him, his mother, and 4 siblings for 10 years, and how they survived and finally escaped. Episode 2 taps into Mark's deep well of knowledge regarding law enforcement interventions and intimate partner violence and the impact of those interventions on victims and their children. We will play segments of Mark's interview, followed by me and TK Logan discussing the issues he raises. We will start with Mark summarizing his work history with the Nashville Police Department. This podcast contains graphic descriptions of violence and abuse and may not be suitable for all listeners. It was produced by Outrage Us, a web-based nonprofit that works to channel the outrage of gender-based violence into strategies and actions to stop it. You can listen to this and all previously aired Surviving Stalking episodes at outrageus.org.
I'm a retired lieutenant from the Nashville Metropolitan Police Department in Nashville, Tennessee. I spent over 20 years there, and I've worked in many divisions, many positions: patrol officer, patrol sergeant, homicide investigator, sergeant in our forensics unit, intelligence division. I was a SWAT officer for 15 years, in addition to my primary duties. Lieutenant to a domestic violence division. We created a domestic violence division inside the agency of over 30 total personnel that worked nothing but crimes in the family, around 23,000 incidents of domestic violence. Through the years, though, I did work outside the agency with permission of my agency with IACP, which is the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Even though I'd started training my officers in the early 80s around proper response to domestic violence, around 85, 86, I started by invitation of IACP. I traveled around the country with a few other like-minded and like-trained police officers. And we started to train police chiefs on how to formulate their priority around domestic violence. So we were teaching police chiefs in the mid-'80s how to write policies on how to properly respond, investigate, charge, and deal with domestic violence. This was sort of a first of. There'd never been any national effort to train chiefs on making this a high priority. At the time, it was, pretty minor crime for police to investigate.
So it just really strikes me how far we have come in some ways with regard to domestic violence, where when Mark started out, it wasn't taken very seriously or talked a whole lot about in society. So he grew up and chose a career path during that time when little help was available for victims. But really the question is, so why did he decide to become a police officer? And we asked him that question.
I think the primary reason I became a police officer, at least in my mind, was because of domestic violence. Growing up in a home filled with violence for 10 years with an abusive stepfather was more than a motivator to convince me that I wanted to arrest him and people like him, because I never arrested him. But I spent my career trying to educate the system to what the crime is really all about, and how it's, one of the most committed and least reported crimes in the country, why victims stay, what exposure to violence to children looks like, what the tricks of the offender might be, the profile of the offender, the understanding for victims, all those things I learned long before I got into policing. And it was a bit of a conflict for me because in the 70s when I went into law enforcement in my academy classes, I remember the discussions around domestic violence. They didn't call it violence against women then, domestic violence, and everything they taught me was wrong. And I wanted to stand up and say that won't work, but I was afraid that if I objected to an improper education about domestic violence, then they would have kicked me out. Because after all, when you're a recruit, you don't know anything. So you can't stand up in the classroom and say, but I brought a childhood of experience of exposure to domestic violence with me. Wouldn't it be valuable to you? But I was afraid to say anything about it. So I learned my lessons early on as a kid, and then I got into the law enforcement family, and I realized that there was a complete void of understanding about what happens in homes filled with domestic violence. So I realized what my journey was going to look like, that I had to slowly but surely, in government service, you don't do things quickly. The president not long ago was giving a speech and he was talking about how you change government, and he said, changing government is it's not like turning a cruise ship. Not like turning a speedboat. It's more like turning a cruise ship. It just takes a gradual course corrections. So I had to be patient, even though I could see people suffering because of the inadequate response, like my mother. But I had to be patient, so it was more like a gentle pressure, relentlessly applied formula. And it worked out in the end. I mean, we won. We're not where we need to be yet, but I started to find like-minded people in law enforcement, but who really gave me the charge, the power, I think, to speak about this the way I think you should, was advocates. I am an advocate, trained, nurtured, produced police officer around domestic violence. They brought me in early on in the late 70s, early 80s, and they realized that I could be a Confederate, for the cause. And I hadn't studied the women's movement. I mean, I grew up in the South in the 60s, so I understood the civil rights movement. And the women's movement and the civil rights movement are parallel movements. They share similar, DNA. So they brought me in and taught me all the things around the cycle, around the difficulties of leaving. They actually filled in the blanks of questions that I had as a child. And once they gave me the complete sentences, then I spoke their words to police, and I hadn't stopped since.
Well, people who choose law enforcement as a career are just as likely to have experienced child abuse or intimate partner violence in their homes or witnessed it as the general population. Yet it has been and continues to be a very long, slow path to effective law enforcement interventions. While interventions currently are light years ahead of where they were a few decades ago, we still can't assure victims that they will get the help or the response they want and need if and when they call for help. That is so dependent not only on the police department and their community, but on the specific officer who responds.
One of the things I really appreciate about what Mark does is he has this experience and he helped people when he was a police officer, but now he's speaking about those two things together. And I appreciate that because there's sort of this idea out there that if you've witnessed domestic violence, particularly as a male, you're going to grow up to be a perpetrator. And there are reasons that people think that, but unfortunately we don't have a household survey. What we don't know is how many people witnessed and grew up to be heroes, something like what I see Mark as, really. And I think there's a lot of them out there, but they're just not talking about their stories. And I think we really have to think about what shapes people and to the various paths we take, and maybe think about reaching out to children to turn that around. I mean, that would be the goal, obviously.
Let's listen to the next clip, shall we?
So the question is, why didn't I become an abuser? And I have to be completely and absolutely honest with you. It's something that I have always thought about and kept in check. I guess it's almost like when you grow up with an alcoholic and you worry about being an alcoholic yourself, and you have to constantly check yourself because you know what that looks like and you know how that happens and how easy it is to fall into that trap of substance abuse. So I've always, kept it in my mind that I can't be that way because I have to honor my mother. I can't be that way because I don't want to know what it feels like to abuse somebody else. I have to always remember that the emotion, the fear, the sounds, the smell of violence, and it has all those things. I don't want anybody to experience that. I want to think that I learned control and restraint from my mother, which was part of my building my character as a man. And those are things you don't do. And that served me as well. So it was kind of it was a counterbalance. I had the training and the knowledge and the exposure to be violent, and then I got into a career that's filled with violence, and I had to find that balance. How do you use appropriate amount of force? He never did. He used what force was, whatever he needed to get. He used it, and he broke the law every time he did it, but was never held accountable for it. So I think that that was always a bit of a conflict in my mind, but I worked out that conflict well, I think, over the years. All those experiences of survival, I put to good use. Now, I'm not saying here today that if you're a cop or you're a deputy or judge or prosecutor, whatever your job is, that if you are a survivor, that you should talk about this. I honor and respect your silence if you want to be silent about it, but I couldn't be because the stakes are too high, and I realize that. So I've shared this story and with my mother's permission before she passed away to talk about the journey victims travel when they try to get out, and those moments of absolute unbelievable fear of today's the day I'm going to die. Because when you stand at death's door, and I have, and my siblings have, and my mother certainly did, you look at life differently. You put other things aside that really are kind of trivial, and they the daily life of people is important, but just living and breathing is much more important. So if you live with that near-death experience over and over again, it tempers you. Now, I certainly understand this too, that it could have tempered me to be an abuser as well. I could have been an abuser. I certainly had the training for it. But the counterbalance was my mother, who was the most courageous person I've ever known. And I had a couple of uncles that were good role models. When we made it back to Tennessee, these were nonviolent men who loved their families, and just by their very nature were role models. So I was rescued, at an early age by strong men who may not have talked about domestic violence, but understood what it was like to be a man. And being a real man means you don't abuse your wife or your loved ones. Completely opposite of the message that he was trying to teach me as a child. So that's sort of a 10-year journey, and how it impacted me as a child and how it shaped me to be a law enforcement officer.
I am so grateful that Mark is willing to share his story. And he does such a great job of breaking down the factors and influences that shaped him to be a helper and not a herder. There's a lot at work in setting the positive path he took. Would you talk a little about that, TK?
Yeah. I think one of the things that stands out from this clip that he talked about was how trauma and adversity in children often do lead to substance use. And I find that interesting because as a society, I think sometimes we blame then the substance use for the abusive behavior. But we also know from research that if you take away the substance use, it doesn't necessarily change the abusive behavior. You have to look at both issues. So I really appreciate that he said that. And you're right, Teri, he's really good about articulating the pain that he went through when he's a child. The other part that kind of stands out to me is that even though he had this difficult childhood, he is able to point to things that made that difference for him. One, his mom, and that relationship with his mom was so close, and he wanted to protect her. And I think that it seems like that influenced him to kind of grow up to be that kind of protector. And that's what's driving a lot of his. And then the second piece that strikes me is just how important other people, whether it's a close relative or even a neighbor. I mean, it could be any role model that you could have such a profound influence on a child to model what a good relationship looks like, so that their world isn't just defined by that small, narrow, what happened in their household kind of thing.
And I want to add to that, though, then there was his stepfather who was modeling domination and control over others through fear and abuse and seemingly practiced no restraint. And Mark has visceral associations with the abuse he experienced in his childhood when he talked about the emotion, the fear, the sounds, the smell of violence. It was also repugnant to him. And those experiences made him reject rather than embrace abuse. So, he found his power as a man by becoming a police officer and stopping other abusers. Let's hear what Mark has to say about officers who are abusive and also about mentoring the next generation of officers to build on the momentum that we currently have to stop intimate partner violence.
We're at the frontier of understanding violence in the police family. Some studies show 24 to 40%. I don't think it's quite that high. And I say that because I have a police department that has taken responsibility for and correctly investigates crimes committed in the police family, and the numbers aren't that high in one particular police department. But if you pick people from the general population to work in the criminal justice system, and let's say 10 to 15% of the general population is involved in violence in the relationship, you at least have a 10 to 15% chance of getting someone in ranks who's a violent offender. How do you keep them out? What does the early warning system look like? How do you make sure that we're all communicating that there's no acceptable level of violence in the police family? How do we mentor with young women and men in policing? How do we, by our own example, show them that we don't joke about sex assault? We don't joke about child abuse. None of this is a joke. That it's our job to make sure people are safe and live free. And we have to make sure that when we leave our policing, as we retire, right, and we move on, that what we leave behind is an improved society. And part of that is having a serious, concern and belief that there is no excuse for domestic violence or sex assault. And we have to instill that in and remind these young guardians, because they're going to be leading one day too. So this is that gentle pressure relentlessly applied I talk about. This is that slowly nurturing these young people who do this work, young judges, young prosecutors, young cops, young advocates, that we're not through. they're going to be standing on our shoulders because we're standing on the shoulders of people who came before us to got us to this point. So we've come a long way, but we can't stop now. Fight's not over. They're not. Right now, as we're doing this interview, men are abusing and raping their wives and girlfriends. And it's our job to stop it. So we're not done. Right now, police officers are being assaulted and killed in this country. We're not done. Right now, people are living in fear and haven't picked up the phone yet to call the police. We're not done. So we need to constantly remind this next generation, we're not done. So the work is undone. So they've got to do it, and this is a marathon, not a sprint. So we've got work to do. So I hope whatever I say today is an encouragement for the next generation to pick up the mantle and keep moving for one day, so we don't have to talk about violence in the family anymore. I think that's possible. I really do.
So one of the things that stands out to me in this particular clip is just how important these sort of the culture is in shaping how we think about and maybe even treat people, what we kind of call implicit bias, how that plays into that. So even seemingly small things like jokes around the office actually does have an impact when you go out and talk to people. And then the second thing that kind of stands out is, it takes so much courage to walk away from one of these relationships. And it's really hard to do, even though we say all the time, why didn't she just leave? But it isn't easy. And I think we're going to see more of that. But the role that a police officer can play in helping women and children and others, men who are being abused, take those steps is so crucial. Even if they're not even able to make an arrest, but how you treat somebody actually makes a huge difference in whether they're willing to reach out to the police again. And when you chop that piece off, talk about entrapment. I mean, they're already trapped in that relationship, but when you start cutting off options, it becomes really difficult.
Yeah, how and when to make that decision to leave is huge. And the next clip actually is where we asked Mark to share his thoughts about how his mom decided when it was the right time to leave and the safest way to get her and her family out. So let's see what he said about that.
What was obvious for my mother, and I think what's obvious for most women who live in violence, is that there's no quick fix, but there's a hell of a lot of different pressures and opinions and reasons why you would stay. Does that make sense? So there seems to be a constant battle of conflicts going on inside the mind of a victim. It's love, it's food, it's shelter, it's religion, it's alienating your children from their father, it's community, it's all those things that are a conflict for victims. So it is part of the reasoning that goes through the victim's mind when they're trying to decide to get out. This is why it is a process. It's that process of working through it. So what my mother didn't have, what's available today are options. And this is one of the things that I think police should be well schooled in. Because if you've got options for victims, then you give them the opportunity to get out faster. They may not do it immediately, and you may be frustrated by that, them not acting immediately, because after all, we're accustomed to people doing things immediately. We tell people to do things and they have to do it immediately, because that's what the police do. So when we tell someone who's in domestic violence to do something immediately and they don't do it, then instead of looking at the offender and saying, this person is trapped in this horrific relationship because of you, we look at the victim and say, well, if it's me, I'd just leave. I don't understand why you would stay. So we put another layer of difficulty on the victim by blaming them for staying. And now you're saying it as a police officer. So this could be deadly. So we have to understand that conflict that's going on inside the victim when we talk to them. Don't look at it as them trying to frustrate you. Look at it as proof positive that this is a victim of domestic violence. Why else would somebody stay with someone who's beating the living hell out of them, unless they were a victim of domestic violence. We don't, see stranger assaults like this. You don't see a stranger being abused or beaten, and that stranger looking for that offender the next day, right? Or bonding them out of jail. That's not going to happen. But the nature of this crime, traps that victim. So we should honor and appreciate that fact as responding officers. And if we do, then we're more likely to give that person more options to get out. We're more likely to listen to her without interrupting. We're more likely not to blame her, knowing if we ask her the word why, she starts blaming herself why she stays. So if we understand that journey she's on, then we're able to give her more service. And that doesn't necessarily always mean arresting somebody. You may not have enough evidence to arrest. But never leave a scene of a domestic violence call without leaving a victim with encouragement and an option to get out. Because you may have just robbed somebody from their escape from a homicide.
So one of the basic human needs is, if you even think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's the second thing in the column, which is safety. But what happens to us if you can't see safety? You're not safe at home, but you don't know if you're safe leaving. So that's the first kind of component of this. And also the fact that police, for most of us, is supposed to represent safety, a safe option. I mean, that's what we thought. That's what we see on TV. That's what we've been trained as children. So when police are no longer safe for us to call, then it just shrinks your options. And it also makes me think about the courage it takes to leave. Because actually leaving is one of the most dangerous times. That's when the vast majority of fatalities occur. And it doesn't always stop the stalking. I think women have to ask themselves, can I do it? Can I leave? Do I have the resources, which is a huge burden? Is it worth it? And that question, they think about safety, not just for themselves, but for their children. What does that mean for their children? What does that mean for other agencies becoming involved and that kind of thing? And then finally, can I sustain it? I mean, we kind of always act like these things are so easy when they are really not. And on top of that, we underestimate the trauma response, which is a real thing that changes your brain and changes your physiology and your health, and how that might affect, again, the ability to just walk away from something and our perceptions about safety.
And also the fact that victims are so often judged for staying, but also judged if they leave. And the judgments come from all directions, from folks in the community, friends, families, coworkers, folks in their faith communities. Kids need their dad, you should be staying. And so they have so much to consider. And when people say, why don't you just leave? It's just such a loaded question that brings so much judgment and blame with it. And I don't know, in my experience in working with survivors, I feel like it is such a process leaving, because you have to gather everything you need, like your when you leave, where are you going to go if you are actually the one leaving? Or if you're staying at home, how are you going to make that home safe? How are you going to support yourself and your children if you might not have money coming in for a while? How is the kids' schooling going to work? Just so many factors. If you have a job, how is it going to affect that? So to walk in, and especially if you're someone wearing a badge, and say, you need to leave, that's not a fair question. And the other issue you bring up is, are they even going to be more safer? Are they going to be safer if they do? And maybe they're going to be at greater risk. And so that is the biggest consideration of all. So at every step of this process, they need to be able to gather the resources, supports, protections, everything they need to put it in place to have the greatest chance that they're going to be able to leave safely and successfully.
So when a police officer comes in, and again, I think victims sometimes do, or a lot of times do understand, hey, I don't have enough evidence to, to arrest or right this moment or whatever, but it's the way that you interact with that victim can make all the difference in the world. Again, like I said before, will she call again, or did she feel judged? Did she feel blamed? Did she feel that he or she, that officer, kind of blew it off, like, oh, this isn't that serious? Because I don't know, like, all of those judgments, victims feel that as well and are very sensitive to even the smallest cues. So, and I've seen officers who go out on a call and they weren't able to arrest, but they were able to provide some resources. And just that alone, A, it educates her about what's out there. That might be very helpful, that maybe she didn't know before. And B, that officer saw it as important enough for her to say, hey, here's some things you can do when you are ready. I just think that can make all the difference in the world.
I do too. And asking what will make you safer? What do you need to put everything in place that you need? Let's hear a little more of what Mark has to say about police telling victims what they should or should not do.
Wow. It's to give victims advice is something that I'm uncomfortable with. I have to be honest with you. I mean, and then let me explain why I am often reluctant to give victims advice. It would be me as a man telling a woman what she's got to do. She already has that. She's living with someone who tells her what to do all the time. She doesn't need somebody else to tell her what to do. I've seen judges do this in court. Ma'am, what you need to do. I've seen family members. Well, if it was me, I'd just do this, right? I've seen prosecutors say, well, we're going to drop your charge if you don't come to court tomorrow. I've seen these advices given to victims, and it kind of bothers me. What I want to give victims is encouragement and options. I want them to have hope and faith. And the way I give hope and faith to a victim in me is to be honest with a victim and give them what they need and listen and be kind and patient and caring. And you don't have to run up and hug and kiss everybody you deal with as an officer. But it's the same as a hug and kiss when you're patient and you listen to somebody. I want victims to understand that your police have to do certain things when they come to the scene because these are dangerous calls. And you, because listen to me, you know they're dangerous. It's a violence call. You live in it. There are certain things they have to do to survive. They have to control people at the scene. They have to separate the parties. They have to interview your children separately. They have to ask you questions again and again and again just to check to make sure that's consistent. They may search you. They may search your spouse. They may look in your purse. They may look for guns. It looks like, it's an invading force. But all these things mean something when we train officers to put together a case to protect you. So, I want you to be encouraged that, today's officers are spending more time with you. But know that, for the most part, officers make the right decision. They have to be objective. We can't walk into somebody's house and say, ma'am, most often men are the offenders. Sir, you're under arrest. We can't do that. The law won't allow it. The law is gender blind. So there's requirements for police. But at the same time, we want you to trust the police. We want you to tell the police what you think is important. We don't want you to tell us anything that you don't want to tell us. We want to give you options on how much you want to share with us. We want you to take your time. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with a victim of domestic violence or sex assault to travel at their own pace. Because in law enforcement, if we force people into doing something, they walk away from us and we leave them in peril. Because often for victims, we're the only hope they have. They don't have a resource. They don't have money or health insurance or, travel or a car to get to a shelter that's 2 or 3 hours away. So we want you to tell us what you think you need to tell us. And then We hope that your agency is well trained to understand that you've got to have patience, because you're part of, again, that process of getting that victim out of that relationship on the long term.
What Mark talks about here is important for all of us, no matter what our relationship is with a victim or survivor. Whether we're an officer, an advocate, a friend, a coworker, we need to be offering understanding, options, hope, and support. Officers and really anyone working with someone in an abusive situation might feel frustrated because it seems like what they're doing isn't working. But Mark's message is very clear. Be consistent, be patient, be understanding, and victims will hear the hope and encouragement in your voice, and they'll use that, and it will help them when they are making the decision that the time is right to get out. It'll give them strength. They aren't asking you to make decisions for them, but they do need to know that when they make their decisions, you are there to help them.
Yeah, I think the fact that she or he is alive standing in front of you is, they're good at surviving. And for us to think that we could pop in after knowing them for a very short period of time, that we can tell them what to do is a little bit crazy to me. But yeah, so then the question becomes, well, what can we do? And I think the thing to focus on there is to support their autonomy or their choices, or maybe empowering them for when they are ready to take the next steps, in whatever steps they feel they need to take in their own timing. Again, going back to this idea, like, nothing's going to happen if they're not alive. They're alive and they're surviving. They are the experts on that. And it's interesting to me, too, we haven't really been talking a whole lot about children so far, as if, it's just the mom right now, but actually we know that's bigger than that. So let's see what Mark says about when children are present when the police shows up.
I recommend so much when it comes to children, because I'm partial to this topic, because I'm a child survivor. A lot of cops are child survivors. And there's so much that we don't know, and I completely understand why we're still just learning about children. It's because over the years we've been so busy with the adults. We focus on the primary victim of the assault. We focus on the primary offender. And these are necessary things. For law enforcement, any officer in this country will tell you, or any other Western country will tell you, that there are things you have to do before you even start your investigation. You have to have the information about both parties before you get there, if you can get it. You have to worry about your own personal safety when you approach. You have to worry about your safety when you're in the home. You have to worry about your safety when you're leaving the home. You have to worry about your safety when you're in court. I mean, all these things are always constantly on your mind. So that police mind is just humming like a sewing machine, right? So there's things we have to do, to make sure that we're okay. And in that complex, dynamic, machinations of all these things running around in your mind as a police officer, we see just images and flashes of children, and sometimes we don't talk to those kids. We've got to start changing the method and the approach and the understanding and the skill to find time every time we go to a domestic violence call to put an eye on that child for anything, for the most part, to see if they're physically harmed. Then we need to interview that child to find out what's happened. I recommend the police not to interview children in front of their parents because of the pressure, get them out of eyesight and earshot of that parent. Now, if they're suspect in a crime, that's different. But if they're witnesses, we don't have to interview that child in front of that parent. I want officers to understand what children think about us. I remember this very well, what cops looked like when I was a child. They were gigantic, they were big, the gun was big, the badge was big, their voice was big, they were scary, big people. Try for a moment as you start your interview with that child to understand what you look like to them. Turn that image around and see yourself when you sit down to talk to a child. Look at their nonverbal communication, how they move their body, how they read you. Understand that they may be non-spontaneous. They may not interact with you like other children do. Understand that there's positive and negatives to the police approach, because they were told just before you got there, if you talk to the police, I'll kill you, I'll kill your mom. Or there's this constant sort of, the police are the bad guys, the police are the bad guys. So there's this propaganda that's just every moment often in homes, because the police come to take control of a controlling personality. And using those children in that control is part of it, right? So I'm going to use my child. They're going to agree with me. They're not going to talk to you. They're going to run away from you. They're my best ally here, because they're afraid, because siblings will often close ranks and protect themselves by being silent. Silence is golden for the offender, and it's survival for children. So if we understand that and more, when we go to the scene, then we start to win back the confidence of that child. The payoff here is that even though you don't make an arrest sometimes, that when you leave, the image of you as an officer in the mind of that child is positive, not negative. Paying attention to that child, building rapport with them, having a conversation with them, even if you don't talk about what they saw, because they're going to be stuck there when you pull away. They can't get in that patrol car and drive away with you. I know it breaks the heart of officers every day, and right now it's happening. When an officer pulls away and a child's left in harm's way, they just hate it. It just drives cops crazy. So don't let it drive you crazy. Leave some of you at that scene. Leave a positive image of a deputy or an officer by telling the child, don't get trapped in a small room. Don't run to your bedroom. Don't get under the covers. Get away. Find a friend. Get on the phone. Call 911. Stay on the phone with the dispatcher. But the most important thing you can say to a child, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. Say it again and again and again and again. Because in the minds of these children, they believe it is their fault, because they told us their fault. So part of what we want to do is we want to win the battle, but we want to win the war too. And if we leave the image of us with children, then the next time it happens, they're more likely to pick up that phone and call that officer that left them with a positive image. So that means what you say to somebody can save a life. And I don't know what kind of value you can put on that. Because can you put a value on human life? I don't think you can.
So this is another kind of aspect that always gives me pause, is how we always act like witnessing as a child domestic violence is a dichotomy, yes, no, when in reality that is so far from the truth. That you can range from maybe a child being in his bedroom and hearing parents fighting to I don't know, for example, Susan Still's story. I don't know if you remember her, Teri, but her children were forced to participate in the abuse. And when the children were asked how they thought about that, what they said is they didn't know any different. So even in the case where maybe the child hears the fighting in the bedroom, it's a cumulative experience. So for someone to come in and tell those kids after just a few minutes, they probably don't even know the full extent of what has gone on in that household and what they've had to do to survive. Advice like that, yeah, I mean, again, I just makes me think how important it is to give children hope and to empower them. But, when you're a kid, your choices, you're just so trapped. And I just really love how he emphasizes over and over to the child, I believe you, I believe you. And that is just such an important, validating thing to help empower the children. Or it's not your fault, I guess is what he says. It's not your fault.
I think his point of leaving children with thinking about the police officer as someone who can help them and not to be feared, that's the bottom line. be gentle, engage with them. But the most important thing is that they feel like you are someone who will protect them and who they can reach out to for help, and maybe they will be the one calling 911 the next time. Let's listen to this next clip where Mark talks a little more about being the right officer when someone calls for help.
There's a few things that I would, and by the way, I stress when I talk to officers that we need to understand that people sometimes self-medicate, that victims will often, and when they're caught in the spiral of trauma and pain and suffering, just like cops, and I've got friends in law enforcement who've lost their careers because they self-medicated because of the emotional labor of the work that law enforcement officers do. We kill ourselves more than suspects do. And we're looking at that now closer to see how we can take care of the emotional state of our young deputies and officers with some success. So we should understand that when we go to the scene, if someone's using drugs or alcohol, it may be because they just kind of numb themselves just to get by day in and day out. My mother didn't do that, but she very well could have. So it's important to us to understand that people using drugs or alcohol sometimes don't understand how much risk they're in. And offenders who are using drugs or alcohol are more likely to use that force faster. So those are important factors in investigating these crimes. But the other thing is, I think there's some simple things you can do. I mean, you can just, and this is a catchphrase that's being used around the country with sex assault programs. Austin's using it, Reno's using it. Start by believing. You start your investigation by believing, because victims have been told that they're not going to be believed. And if we indicate that we don't believe, then the victim stops. They just say, you're the wrong person. I actually had a woman one night, I was a patrol sergeant, and it was the end of the detail, and I was filling out my paperwork for the end of the shift, and her phone rang at the station. And she said, are you the sergeant over this area where she lived? And I said, yes, ma'am. She said, I'm a victim of domestic violence, and you sent me the wrong officer. And that's not a normal everyday call. The dispatcher, she called the dispatcher gave me my number at the station. And I said, what do you mean? She said, your officer came to the scene, and he walked in, he never sat down, he folded his arms, he looked at me like he didn't want to be there, he kept looking at his watch, he acted like he wanted to leave. I didn't want to talk to him because I couldn't trust him. And I apologized to her. And I said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to send you the right officer. And I dispatched another officer who I knew was very good at working domestic violence calls, and I called the wrong officer to the station. And he and I had a moment, and I made him the right officer, starting at that night. And over the time that we worked together, I turned him into the right officer. Because we need to understand that it's not just what we say, it's what we look like to victims. We need to understand that when someone starts to tell you a story like this, they're putting their lives in your hands. And this is a pretty precious thing. I think when you talk to most people, if you ask them, how many people do you know that you're willing to put your life in their hands, it's a short list. For me, it's mostly cops, a few family members. So we need to honor that moment when someone tells you what they tell you about something that they've never told anybody else before. So we need to all be the right officer and listen and believe victims who tell us they are suffering because of domestic violence.
I just really have to say how much I admire the courage of the woman who stood up for herself and at least, I mean, I know she didn't know what was going to happen, but she wanted something more to happen, and he was open to it. I don't know that I would have ever thought of that option or had the courage to actually make that call and to try to get a different outcome. But it is actually an option that people can do. Then the second thing that I really want to point out here is, sometimes calling the police can actually be punishing in a way. And I've heard stories of where when the police come and they see that the victim has been using substances and they don't really understand that connection of trauma and coping with both physical and emotional pain when you just have so few options in your life. So, but I've heard of police coming and showing up and seeing that, and there's that stigma and bias with regard to substance use. And so they'll tell the victim, if you call me again, you're both going to go to jail. Well, talk about not only cutting off that option, but actually now she's running scared that if the neighbors call her or anyone else calls her, and these circumstances she doesn't have any control over, that she no longer has help. And not only that, she might actually go to jail, which is going to make everything worse, particularly if you have children, young children. So, it's just heartbreaking that it could go actually the opposite way from safety and make someone even less safe. And let's even talk about how that police response feels to an abuser. So you've now really even more disempowered a victim and giving more power to the abuser. Because if you don't think he isn't going to use that to continue his domination and power over her, crazy.
Like you, I loved this segment of Mark's interview because I thought it was just absolutely beautiful and courageous that survivor called the police department when she was unhappy with the response and said it wasn't the right officer. As you said, I had to repeat that, though, because that did take some courage. And I believe we don't do that often enough when from whatever agency. It doesn't have to be the police. If you're not getting the response you need, go up the line. And if you're uncomfortable going up the line, ask an advocate if they can do that with you, or whoever you're working with, or even a friend, to pursue it. Don't just give up unless unless the police are really bad and you feel like you're going to get punished for continuing. But I really do encourage people to go up the line, because I've seen many times where that has turned around the police response. I feel like today we've really come full circle with what we've talked about in discussing Mark Wynn's interviews, because the final message we're taking from Mark really is to be the right officer, the right advocate, the right prosecutor, the right coworker, friend, family member, by starting with believing the person who is telling you that they have been the victim of stalking, abuse, sexual violence, human trafficking, whatever it is. No matter what your role is with that person, if you get one thing out of this podcast, I hope it's to be the person that the person you're connected with went to for help, not someone who doubts that they need help or starts with looking for their weaknesses or challenges in life. Be the person who supports them and encourages them and gives them hope. So in a way, we're kind of ending with where we should start. I know, that some places are using a little theme, start by believing. And it is incredibly important, because a lot of victims of all types of abuse aren't believed when they start. People, a lot of times, if it's something like child sexual abuse, they're asked, are you sure that happened? You don't think that was just a dream? So that is crushing when you've had a really traumatic experience. And that is the feedback you get. A lot of times people then don't continue. They don't talk to anyone about it, and there's a lot of silence. It keeps that silence going. So anyway, that's, I think, a good way to sum up what we've been talking about. And do you want to add anything to that?
I just want to say, look, as a society, we're always looking for simple answers. So here's it's a simple thing. Start by believing. It's just that simple. That can change the nature of how you your attitudes, your thoughts, which can play into your implicit biases, and the victim will know, regardless of what other actions you take, if you just start by believing. It's just simple. It's simple.
So let's end with a final clip from Mark that is specifically directed toward police officers, but something we can all learn from.
If you have a police or sheriff's department that's ill-trained, improperly led, has a culture of not understanding violence against women, and you as a victim call your advocate, or you reach out to an advocate in your community, and that advocate says, this is not an agency you can trust, I don't blame a victim for not calling the police. As I said earlier, what we're doing here is we're asking somebody to make themselves more vulnerable to the offender, to put your life in the hands of a stranger, which is an officer. And if they treat you indifferently and they don't care, then reporting can become more dangerous often than the offender. So it's critical for law enforcement to understand what's at stake here. Your body language, your tone, your voice, your demeanor, the time on call, your detail, your listening skills, all that is important to keep somebody alive. And if you don't exhibit that every single time you go on a call, your behavior may be the thing that kept her from calling. And the next call you may get, it's a homicide. So you understanding their trust in you is critical to keeping people alive. And I know when you raise your hand, take your badge, it's exactly what you want to do. You want to spend your life making sure that people stay alive. And you want to dishonor that oath. Just turn away from victims of domestic violence. That's the fastest way to do it.
If you are being stalked, you are not alone. According to a 2022 CDC report, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men in America have experienced stalking at some point during their lifetimes. For more information, tools, and resources on stalking, and to hear all previous episodes in this series, go to outrageus.org. To find help in your area, contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE, SAFE, or go to thehotline.org. This podcast was produced by Outrage Us Incorporated in partnership with the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History and the University of Kentucky Libraries. It was edited by Hilary Sykes.